1988. These people are Palestinian Arabs living under the military control of the State of Israel. They're in revolt against their Israeli rulers. They claim that the Israelis have taken over their land. The Israelis claim the land is theirs and that they are fully justified in putting down this uprising. What's the basis of these claims? We asked a Palestinian political figure, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi.
The Palestinians are a very ancient people with a long tradition. Many of us go back to even pre-Roman, pre-Jewish times, to the Canaanite times, thousands of years ago. The Palestinians, by the 7th century, were primarily Muslim, but we also trace ourselves to the early Christian presence as well. By now, the Palestinians have become a mixture of the different tribal movements and intermarriage and intermingling in the land of Palestine, and therefore we have become the product of a very rich cultural heritage.
The Jewish claim is put by a founding member of Peace Now, Dr. Yuli Tamir.
Well, hundreds of years before Christ, Jews lived in the Holy Land. They were sent to exile by the Romans at 70 AD, when the Second Temple, which was then the center of Jewish communal life and religious life, was destroyed by the Romans. They since then lived in exile, retaining their communal life and religious belief. Also, all these years in exile, they have desired to come back to Israel, especially to Jerusalem.
Since the 16th century, the Holy Land, or Palestine, had been a province of the Turkish Empire. Most of its inhabitants were Arab. But during the late 19th century, some Jews began coming back to their former home. To the Jews, then suffering persecution in Europe, it seemed to be a haven. Religious Jews just wanted somewhere where they could live and practice their religion in peace. But others wanted their own nation-state. They began to buy land and set up exclusively Jewish, socialist, collective farms, later called. At first, they lived peaceably with the native Palestinian population. A fair number of Palestinians lived and worked in the towns. Most people, though, were peasant farmers. They exported fruit and grain. Others were fishermen, and some, like the Bedouin, roamed the desert as camel traders. By 1914, 40 kibbutzim had been established. Jews now made up 8% of the total population. The scene was set for conflict and was made worse by outside events. During the First World War, Britain was fighting the Turks. Although she had no rights in Palestine, Britain promised the Arabs independence from the Turks if they helped, and they agreed. But at about the same time, Britain was holding out the hope of giving the Jews a national home in Palestine. Britain and her allies were victorious. Turkey lost her empire, and Britain was given a mandate to control Palestine until its people were ready to form their own government. During the 1920s, more Jews arrived. The Palestinians increasingly began to resent these outsiders. The two peoples clashed. And again, world events made matters worse. During the 1930s, the Nazis in Germany were persecuting the Jews. Many fled for safety to Palestine. In 1935, the number of Jews there doubled. They now made up 30% of the population. The Palestinians revolted, and the British put a brake on the number of Jews allowed in. But at the end of the Second World War, the situation was different. By then, the whole world knew that 6 million Jews had died in Nazi concentration camps. The Jewish need for a safe homeland was clear. Pressure was put on Britain to allow Jewish refugees into Palestine once more. Britain agreed, but the result was that the British were hated by the Palestinians for allowing too many Jews to enter, and hated by many Jews for not allowing enough. Weakened by war and facing a mounting campaign of terrorism, the British decided to give up their mandate early, though for the time being their troops remained. In 1947, the future of Palestine was handed over to the United Nations. By this time, 33% of the population was Jewish, and Jews owned 7% of the country. The UN decided to partition it. The Palestinians were offered land in the north, near Gaza, and the west bank of the Jordan. The Jews, the remainder. The area around Jerusalem would be an international zone. The Palestinians and neighbouring Arab states rejected the plan. The Jews accepted it. On the day the British troops left in 1948, the Jews claimed the state of Israel. Next day, 5 Arab countries invaded in defence of Palestine. A year later, the Israelis had gained more of the north, part of the West Bank, half Jerusalem, and part of the Gaza Strip. Egypt held the rest of the Strip and West Bank. During and after this war, 2/3 of the Palestinians left. Most ended up in overcrowded refugee camps in neighbouring Arab countries. Epidemics were rife. Many people depended on UN rations to survive. Young people born in the camps grew up in an atmosphere of bitterness.
Many Palestinians were deported by the Israelis, and many left before the war, being afraid due to our propaganda that when the Israelis will come, they will either harm them or massacre them.
The Palestinians were not prepared for war. The Palestinians did not have an army. Therefore, when violence and conflict erupted, many of them were not equipped to deal with it. But the main reason is the fact that Palestinians left as a result of being expelled by the Jewish armed gangs then, as a result of a series of massacres, as a result of a policy of intimidation.
All of these Palestinians stayed in refugee camps, I think for 2 reasons. Partly because they felt a communal obligation to stay within the Palestinian community, believing that if they will leave the camps, they will actually lose the right to return to their houses in Israel. And partly because the Arab state wanted them to stay there, using the refugee problem as a weapon against Israel.
They became refugees in the Arab camps, in the neighboring countries, fully believing that this was a temporary condition, and they did not want to be integrated or to melt in an Arab society around them because they wanted to return, and they were convinced that they would be able to go back. At that time, the Palestinians thought that the confrontation was between Israel and the Arab countries, and that the Arab countries are going to help them liberate Palestine and help them return to their lands.
Their best bet seemed to be Nasser, the ruler of Egypt. He'd set out to make himself the champion of all the Arab peoples. For years, he also took the lead in opposing the Israeli state and supporting the Palestinians. But other Arabs were jealous of his influence. By 1967, Arab rivalries had pressured him into an alliance with Syria and Jordan, and it seemed as though they were about to attack Israel. Yet it was Israel that struck first. The Israelis destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, defeated the Egyptian army, and even captured part of Syria. They took over the West Bank of Jordan and annexed all Jerusalem, including the holy places of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Why did the Israelis launch this war?
Israel was really worried that the Arab troops are going to invade Israel, and this is actually going to be the end of the existence of Israel. They have started the war seeing it as a defensive war, actually a war for the life of the state.
As a result of this latest war, Israel more than doubled its size, occupying part of Syria, all the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and Egypt's Sinai Desert. Israel had gained safer frontiers, but at the expense of others. The UN called for Israel's withdrawal from these territories, but insisted on the right of Israel to exist in peace. The Arabs refused to recognize this right, so Israel refused to withdraw. Meanwhile, nearly 200,000 Palestinians had become refugees, some for the second time. Even so, Israel now ruled up to 1.5 million Palestinians in Jerusalem and the occupied territories. They were not Israeli citizens. They had no vote, and outside Jerusalem they were ruled by the army. Yet they still had their own local leaders. And the bridges across the Jordan were kept open so Arabs could visit and trade with each other. But Israeli industry was looking for cheap labor, and some Arabs began to leave their farms to work in Israel itself. In their absence, their land often fell into disuse, and Israeli settlers began to move in. They gained not only farmland, but land that was strategically important, that they could defend against future Arab attacks. The Palestinians had few rights left. Who would be able to help them now? Since 1957, some Palestinians had organized groups based in Arab countries which carried out guerrilla attacks on Israel. They wanted a return to their homeland and self-rule. The most effective group had been formed with Nasser's backing in 1964. It was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. One of its leaders was Yasser Arafat. After the Arab defeat in 1967, the PLO decided to carry on the armed struggle alone, if necessary.
At that time, many Palestinians thought that, or firmly believed that Israel was an illegal entity and it had to be dismantled, and that the whole of the state of Palestine had to be liberated, and it had to be done by Palestinian effort, and armed struggle was the means adopted by the Palestinians.
Most Palestinian refugees lived in Jordan. There, the PLO had created what was almost a state within a state and posed a real threat to the authority of the King, Hussein. Some breakaway groups got completely out of hand. They turned to international terrorism. They hijacked and blew up planes, keeping the passengers hostage until Arab prisoners of the Israelis were released. Such actions made world headlines and forced people to remember Palestinian grievances. This hijacking on straw for King Hussein. He turned his army on the PLO. Many were killed, including civilians. After 10 days hard fighting, the PLO moved out, this time to Lebanon. There they found recruits of all ages and trained them to attack Israel. Meanwhile, Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, was determined to regain Sinai. He decided only a war would make Israel hand it back. Together with Syria, Egypt suddenly invaded the occupied territories in 1973. After inflicting heavy losses on Israel, the Arabs were finally pushed back. During this war, the oil-producing states of the Arab world cut down or banned the sale of oil to the West. Concerned at losing its supplies, the West persuaded Israel to take part in a ceasefire. And now the PLO realized that there were limits to what could be achieved by war or terrorism. They tried diplomacy instead. By 1974, Yasser Arafat, now leader of the PLO, had persuaded the Arab states to recognize his organization as the only true representative of the Palestinian people. He also succeeded in gaining UN recognition of the Palestinian right to self-rule. In 1977, Anwar Sadat visited Israel to appeal for reconciliation. Encouraged by the US, he later became the first Arab leader to sign a peace treaty with Israel. In return, he got back the Sinai. Now, at peace with Egypt, Israel could afford to be tougher with the PLO, which had mounted attacks on her from Lebanon. In Lebanon, the presence of the PLO had contributed to a civil war. The PLO controlled most of the south, and in 1982, the Israelis invaded. They besieged and bombarded Beirut, the capital. There was enormous loss of life among Lebanese civilians and refugees, as well as the PLO. The PLO leadership left, but the Israelis stayed on, becoming involved in the civil war. Many Israelis felt for the first time that this was not a justifiable war of self-defense against a state that threatened them. Peace Now staged huge demonstrations against the war. Public opinion and external pressure forced a temporary withdrawal from Lebanon. But inside Israel from 1977, there'd been a shift to the right in Israeli politics. This made matters worse for the Palestinians who lived there. Backed by extreme religious and nationalist groups, the government allowed hundreds more settlements in the occupied territories. Many of the settlements were in the best land, and some of the settlers were prepared to defend their position by force. Besides that, the government had not developed Arab industry in the occupied territories. So the Palestinians had become increasingly dependent on low-paid jobs in the Israeli cities, getting up at 4 in the morning to go to work. Because they were seen as the enemy, they weren't allowed to sleep there. They also had to carry identity passes at all times or face the danger of arrest. Bitterness against the Israeli occupation ran deep. The Palestinians were allowed their own system of education. So some people think that their demand for a state was fostered in their schools and universities. Certainly by the mid-1980s, the occupied territories were ripe for confrontation. Then, in 1987, an Israeli truck hit a car and killed 4 Arabs. Demonstrations followed. Sometimes the people involved were very young indeed. Then shopkeepers staged strikes. The authorities imposed curfews. Between the two, Palestinians suffered food shortages. Many took to outright opposition. This became known as the Intifada, or uprising. The Israelis reacted strongly. Even those only suspected of helping the Intifada could have their homes blown up. More and more children were wounded. World opinion turned against Israel. Then in 1988, Arafat got the whole of the PLO to agree to the partition of Israel rather than the destruction of the Israelis. He even said,
"We totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism."
As well as renouncing terrorism, he seemed willing to take part in peace talks.
We want peace. We want peace.
The Palestinians seemed to have won the moral advantage, but efforts to hold a peace conference failed and the uprising went on. What effect did it have?
I think the Israeli now realize that we're dealing with a Palestinian people who has its own legitimate rights. And the core of the conflict is the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, right-wing Israelis are still afraid that if Israel will withdraw from the West Bank, then it will risk its own existence. Left-wing Israelis are accepting now that there has been a change within the PLO and think that now we can have a peace treaty with the Palestinians based on a territorial compromise.
I'm convinced that the Palestinian state is inevitable. The only problem is, do we get it through peace or do we get it through conflict and war?
Soon after those views were recorded, Iraq's President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, claiming it was now part of Iraq. He split the Arab world and set the scene for the Gulf War. He also championed the Palestinian cause, which gained him Arafat's support, and he later launched some of his missiles on Israel. How would these latest events affect the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations?
If you'd like an order form for the notes that accompany these programmes, please contact BBC Education Information on 081 746 1111.
In Germany, you may find some scenes upsetting.
glaube ich, noch mal an das andere Fenster und noch einmal Deutschland.
Like a fire, like a blazing fire, the news spreading across Germany. Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of the Reich. 1 million hearts burning up with joy. We can see banners glowing blood red, and in the center of each one, the symbol of our hope, crooked cross, the swastika. Look at that.
January the 30th, 1933. Nazi brown shirts salute their Führer, their leader, Adolf Hitler. His rise seemed the answer to many people's dreams.
We will have a new Germany.
And we can see thousands of blazing torches now streaming up the Wilhelmstrasse, long columns of brown shirts, victors in a painful struggle.
The brown shirts were the foot soldiers of the Nazi movement. Years later, one of them, Fritz Muhlebach, described his memories of that extraordinary night.
We were, I don't know, like just laughing, you know. We sang, we shouted Heil till we were hoarse. I mean, Adolf Hitler, leader of Germany. We couldn't believe it. When the news came through on the radio, we ran round to a meeting house and they got everything ready. I mean, they were handing out torches. And the best thing, when we marched, the police guarded our path. Like after so many years, the streets were finally ours.
Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
But not every German joined the brown shirts in their celebration that night. For they knew that now in power, the nation, and all those that stood against them, Hitler had promised to destroy.
Our enemies say we Nazis are intolerant, that we're somehow un-German, because we refuse to cooperate with other political parties. I want to make one thing quite clear. They're right. We are intolerant. And I have set myself one task, namely to drive those other parties out of Germany.
Hitler's rise to power would cause death and suffering on a scale rarely seen in history. Yet on January the 30th, 1933, many millions of Germans welcomed Adolf Hitler as their savior. Why? 3 years earlier, 1930, Fritz Muhlebach returns to the northern dock town of Hamburg after a spell at sea and finds Germany in a terrible state. There was no work to be had. Germany, the worst hit country in a worldwide depression. In the streets, chaos, and the police unable to keep order. From every direction, parties promised they had the solution. Communist, Social Democrat, Nazi. 35 parties in all. But right from the start, it was Hitler's Nazis that caught Fritz Muhlebach's eye.
They were like smarter than the other parties. The communists, social democrats. I mean, the Nazis had uniforms, and their boots were like jackboots, always shining. It's impressive. And then, one night I'm down the docks, and I sees this fight. Well, this fella getting beaten up. So I goes in to help him, gets myself a torn ear. It turns out he's this brown shirt. He says, why don't you come along, you know, to him.